August 12th, 1942. 3:20 in the afternoon. Mediterranean Sea, 40 miles from Malta. Captain Dudley Mason stood on the bridge of SS Ohio, looking at a 6-inch crack running across the deck of his ship. The crack extended from starboard to port, just forward of the bridge superstructure. It was not a surface fracture. It was structural. The keel, the steel spine that held the entire vessel together, had snapped. The forward third of the tanker was separating from the aft section. With each wave, the two halves moved independently. The ship was breaking in half while still floating. Mason had been at sea for 34 years. He knew what a fractured keel meant. The ship was finished. Hull integrity was gone. Within minutes, the weight of the cargo and the stress of the waves would complete what the German bomb had started. The two sections would fold, water would flood the compartments, and 10,000 tons of kerosene would spill into the Mediterranean as the wreckage sank. Except Ohio was not sinking. The crack widened with each swell, but the ship remained level. The engines were still running. The rudder still responded. The pumps were keeping pace with the flooding. Something was holding the two halves together, and it was not the hull. Mason walked to the edge of the bridge and looked down at the deck. The crack was visible from above, a dark line splitting his ship in two. He could see daylight through it when the bow rose on a wave. The chief engineer appeared beside him, soot covering his face, hands shaking. "The cargo tanks," the engineer said. "They are still intact. They are acting as bracing." Mason understood immediately. SS Ohio was not a warship. She was a commercial tanker built in Pennsylvania in 1940 to carry petroleum across the Atlantic. Her design was simple: a steel hull wrapped around 6 massive cargo tanks, each one a separate sealed container running nearly the length of the ship. The hull provided shape and buoyancy. The tanks held the cargo. In normal conditions, the hull carried the weight, and the tanks simply floated inside it. The German bomb had destroyed the hull, but missed the tanks. Now the relationship was reversed. The hull was broken, but the tanks were intact. And because the tanks were full, carrying 10,400 tons of kerosene under pressure, they had become structural elements. They were rigid enough to hold the ship together, even though the keel had snapped. Ohio was floating not because of her design, but despite it. She was being held together by her cargo. Mason asked the question that mattered. How long? The engineer had no answer. This was not a scenario anyone had planned for. There were no calculations, no precedents, no engineering tables that addressed a ship held together by its fuel tanks. It could last hours. It could last minutes. The next wave could finish what the bomb had started. The convoy was gone. Mason could see the last escort destroyer disappearing toward the horizon, following the remaining merchant ships toward Malta. Ohio had fallen behind after the second bomb hit had crippled one of her turbines. Now she was alone, 40 miles from safety, moving at 8 knots with a fractured hull and German aircraft circling overhead. Standard procedure was clear. Abandon ship. Get the crew into lifeboats. Wait for rescue. No captain stayed aboard a vessel with a broken keel. It was not courage, it was suicide. The ship would sink, and anyone still aboard would go down with it. Mason looked at the fuel gauges. 10,000 tons. Malta had 3 days of fuel remaining. Without Ohio, the island would go dark by the end of the week. The RAF squadrons would be grounded. The Royal Navy destroyers would sit in harbor. Rommel would receive unrestricted supplies across the Mediterranean. North Africa would fall. Egypt would be threatened. The entire strategic balance would shift. One ship, 10,000 tons. 3 days. Mason told the chief engineer to keep the remaining turbine running. Then he canceled the abandoned ship order. The decision made no technical sense. Ohio was a dead ship floating on borrowed time. Every engineer aboard knew it. Every sailor who looked at that crack understood what it meant. You could see the hull flexing with each wave, the gap widening and narrowing as the two sections moved against each other. Metal was grinding against metal below deck. Rivets were popping. Bulkheads were buckling, but the cargo tanks were holding. That was the fact that mattered. As long as the tanks remained intact, the ship would float. As long as the ship floated, the engines could push it forward. As long as it moved forward, there was a chance of reaching Malta. The Germans did not give them that chance easily. At 4 in the afternoon, another wave of Stukas appeared. 3 aircraft diving in sequence from 6,000 feet. The anti-aircraft crews fired everything they had. The first Stuka released early and missed. The second was hit by a Bofors round and veered off trailing smoke. The third pilot held his dive until 1,200 feet, released, and pulled up so hard the wings nearly broke off. The bomb hit Ohio on the port side amidships. It penetrated the deck, passed through the crew quarters, and detonated inside the No. 4 cargo tank. The explosion was different this time. Not the sharp crack of a hull breach, but a deeper, more sustained roar. Fuel had ignited. Fire erupted from the deck, a column of black smoke rising 200 feet into the air. The No. 4 tank had ruptured. Kerosene was burning inside the ship, and there was no way to extinguish it. The fire crews sprayed foam onto the deck, but it was useless. The fire was internal. It would burn until the fuel was consumed, or until it reached another tank and turned the entire ship into an inferno. Mason watched the smoke pour from his ship and calculated time. The No. 4 tank held approximately 1,700 tons of fuel. If it burned completely, they would lose 16% of the cargo. More importantly, if the fire spread to the adjacent tanks, the ship would explode within minutes. The fire did not spread. The tank design, built to contain petroleum under pressure, also contained the fire. The flames burned hot enough to warp the deck plating and kill anyone in the nearby compartments, but the adjacent tanks remained sealed. The fire consumed what was in the ruptured tank, and then, after 20 minutes, began to subside as the fuel burned out. Ohio was now sailing with a broken keel, a ruptured fuel tank, and active fires in 3 separate compartments. The forward section was listing 4 degrees to starboard. The aft section was sitting lower in the water as the flooded engine room pulled it down. The crack between them had widened to 8 inches. Every engineering principle said the ship should have sunk an hour ago. At 6:30 in the evening, an Italian torpedo bomber came in low from the west. It released its torpedo at 800 yards and turned away. The torpedo ran straight and true, heading directly for Ohio's port side. The helmsman tried to turn, but the damaged steering gear responded slowly. The torpedo struck amidships just below the waterline and detonated against the hull. The explosion lifted the entire port side of the ship out of the water. Steel plating shredded. The port rail bent inward. The blast killed 4 men instantly and flooded 2 more compartments. When the ship settled back, she was listing 11 degrees to port, and the crack in the deck had widened to 12 inches. Mason went below to assess the damage personally. The engine room was flooded to a depth of 5 feet. The remaining turbine was still running, but it was partially submerged. The chief engineer was standing waist-deep in oily water, directing pumps to keep the machinery operational. He looked at Mason and said simply, that they had maybe 2 hours before the water level reached critical systems. Mason returned to the bridge. The sun was setting. Malta was still 35 miles away. At 8 knots, that meant 4 more hours of sailing. But they did not have 4 hours. They had 2, maybe less. The ship was taking on water faster than the pumps could handle. The hull was flexing so severely that men could hear the metal groaning throughout the vessel. The forward section was moving up and down independently from the aft section by as much as 2 feet with each wave. At 7:15, a German bomber hit them with another bomb. This one struck the foredeck and detonated without penetrating the cargo tanks. It killed 2 men and started another fire, but it did not rupture the hull further. The crew extinguished the flames within 15 minutes. At 8 o'clock, the remaining turbine failed. The chief engineer had kept it running for as long as physically possible, but the flooding finally reached the steam lines. The engine room filled with scalding vapor. The crew evacuated. The turbine stopped. Ohio lost power completely. The ship was dead in the water. No engines, no electricity, no pumps. The only systems still functioning were gravity-fed, the steering gear, and a few manual valves. Mason stood in darkness on the bridge, listening to water pour into the hull below. The crack in the deck was now 14 inches wide. He could feel the bow rising and falling independently from the stern. Malta was 30 miles away. They had no power and no way to move. The cargo tanks were still intact, still holding 10,000 tons of fuel, but the ship carrying them was finished. Mason sent a radio message to the convoy escorts. Ohio immobilized. Require tow. At 9:40, 2 British destroyers returned. HMS Penn and HMS Ledbury, both Hunt-class escorts, displacing just over 1,000 tons each. They approached cautiously, circling the crippled tanker. Their captains could see the situation clearly. Ohio was a wreck held together by luck and fuel tanks. Any attempt to tow her would likely pull her apart completely. Commander Swain of HMS Penn came alongside and called across to Mason. His orders were to attempt a tow if possible, but he made it clear that he thought it was suicide. The ship would break apart. The destroyers would be tied to a sinking wreck in waters still controlled by German aircraft and submarines. It was a waste of effort and risked 3 ships instead of 1. Mason did not argue. He simply pointed at the fuel gauges still visible in the fading light. 10,000 tons. Penn acknowledged and began rigging tow lines. August 12, 1942, 10:30 at night. Mediterranean Sea, 30 miles northeast of Malta. HMS Penn took position 300 yards ahead of SS Ohio. Sailors on both ships worked in darkness to connect the tow line, a 4-inch steel cable designed for rescue operations in calm seas. The Mediterranean was not calm. Waves were running at 6 feet, and every swell caused Ohio to flex along the fracture line. The bow rose independently from the stern. The crack in the deck widened and narrowed with each wave. Metal screamed against metal somewhere deep in the hull. Commander Swain watched through binoculars as his crew secured the cable to Ohio's forward bollards. The bollards were mounted on the section of deck that was no longer structurally connected to the rest of the ship. If the tow line pulled too hard, it would not move the tanker. It would simply tear the bow off completely. Swain ordered Penn to begin towing at 3 knots, slow enough to minimize stress on the cable, slow enough that Ohio might hold together. At 3 knots, Malta was 10 hours away. They had until dawn before German aircraft returned. The cable went taut. Penn's engines strained. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Ohio sat motionless in the water, 14,000 tons of dead weight. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tanker began to move. The bow moved first. It swung to port, following Penn's course. The stern followed several seconds later, dragging through the water at a different angle. The crack in the deck widened to 16 inches. Sailors on Ohio's deck could see straight through the gap into the compartments below. Water was visible, sloshing back and forth with the movement of the ship. HMS Ledbury took position alongside Ohio on the starboard side. Her captain's orders were to provide steering assistance. Ohio's rudder still functioned, but with no engine power, there was no hydraulic pressure to move it. Ledbury would push against the tanker's side when course corrections were needed. It was crude, but it was the only option available. By midnight, they had covered 3 miles, 27 miles to Malta, 9 more hours at current speed. The night was dark, no moon, low visibility. German submarines operated freely in these waters, but they hunted by sound. The slow grinding progress of the tow might be quiet enough to avoid detection. Aircraft were the greater threat, and they would not return until dawn. At 1 a.m, the tow line snapped. The cable had been under constant stress for 2 hours. The repeated flexing of Ohio's hull had created oscillating tension that no tow line was designed to withstand. The steel fibers separated one by one until the cable parted with a sound like a gunshot. The loose end whipped back toward Penn, narrowly missing 2 sailors on the aft deck. Ohio drifted to a stop. Penn circled back and began rigging a second line. This process took 40 minutes. By 2 a.m, they were moving again. The second line held for 3 hours. In that time, they covered another 7 miles, 20 miles to Malta. Then at 5 a.m, the line snapped again. This time, the break occurred at Ohio's end. The bollards had torn free from the deck plating. The forward section of the tanker was too weakened to hold the tow points. Commander Swain made the decision to attach the tow line to Ohio's stern instead. This meant Penn would pull the ship backward. The stern section was lower in the water due to flooding, but it was structurally more intact than the bow. The disadvantage was steering. Ships are not designed to be towed backward. The rudder would be useless. Ohio would drift and spin. But there was no alternative. By 6:30 a.m, they were moving again, backward, at 2 knots. The tanker's stern followed Penn while the bow swung in wide arcs. Ledbury pushed against the bow to keep it aligned, but the destroyer could only do so much. Every few minutes, Ohio would begin to turn, and Ledbury would have to reposition and push again. Dawn arrived at 7. German reconnaissance aircraft appeared 20 minutes later. They circled at high altitude, observing but not attacking. They reported the position to their bases in Sicily. Within an hour, bombers would be airborne. At 8 a.m, 18 miles from Malta, the Stukas returned, 6 aircraft in formation. They ignored Penn and Ledbury and focused on Ohio. One bomb hit the starboard rail and detonated on the deck. The explosion killed 3 men and started fires in 2 compartments, but it did not rupture any cargo tanks. Another bomb hit the water directly ahead of the bow. The underwater explosion created a pressure wave that lifted Ohio's forward section and slammed it back down. The crack in the deck widened to 24 inches. For 5 seconds, the 2 halves of the ship were visibly separated. Then they settled back together as the wave passed. Ohio was still floating. The cargo tanks, flexing and bending with each impact, continued to hold. But the hull was finished. There was no longer any structural connection between the bow and stern. The ship existed as 2 independent pieces of wreckage that happened to be touching each other. Commander Swain watched the gap between the sections and understood what he was looking at. The ship would not survive another serious attack. The next bomb would complete the separation. Ohio would break in half completely, and both sections would flood and sink within minutes, taking with them 8,000 tons of fuel and any destroyer still connected by tow line. He sent a message to Malta. SS Ohio critically damaged, hull separated. Estimate ship will break apart completely within hours, requesting permission to abandon tow and evacuate crew. The response arrived 15 minutes later. Continue tow. Fuel required. Accept all risks. Swain read the message twice. Accept all risks meant accept the loss of Ohio, accept the loss of Penn, accept the loss of Ledbury if the tanker went down while they were tied to her. The Admiralty was not asking him to save the ship. They were ordering him to deliver the cargo regardless of cost. He looked at his executive officer. The younger man had read the message as well. They both understood what it meant. Malta needed 8,000 tons of fuel more than the Royal Navy needed 2 destroyers. The calculation was that simple and that final. Swain sent the acknowledgement, continuing tow. By 10 in the morning, Ohio had covered another 4 miles, 14 miles to Malta. But the stern was now sitting 8 feet lower in the water than it should be. Drag had increased dramatically. Penn's engines were at maximum output, and the tow was moving at 1.5 knots. At that speed, Malta was 9 hours away. They would arrive after dark, assuming the ship held together that long. At 11:30, Italian torpedo bombers appeared, 4 aircraft approaching from the northwest at low altitude. Penn and Ledbury opened fire with every anti-aircraft weapon they had. One bomber released its torpedo at 1,000 yards. The weapon ran straight toward Ohio's port side and passed directly under the stern section without detonating. The remaining bombers broke off their attack and withdrew. Ohio continued at 1.5 knots. The gap between the bow and stern sections was now permanently visible. Sailors on deck could see water between the 2 halves of the ship. The only connection was the cargo tanks, bent and stressed, but still intact, acting as the sole structural element holding 8,000 tons of fuel in position. At 2 in the afternoon, 12 miles from Malta, German bombers returned. 9 aircraft in 3 waves. The first wave focused on the destroyers. Penn took a near miss that flooded her forward compartment and reduced her speed. Ledbury was hit by fragments that killed 2 sailors and damaged her radar. The second wave targeted Ohio. 1 bomb hit the deck amidships and detonated inside the superstructure. The explosion destroyed the bridge, killed everyone inside, and started fires that spread to the crew quarters. Captain Mason was on deck supervising damage control when the superstructure exploded. He lost his command center, his navigation equipment, and his ability to communicate with the destroyers except by signal flags and shouted commands across the water. The third wave approached at 4 in the afternoon. By this time, Ohio was barely recognizable as a ship. The bow section was canted 15 degrees to starboard. The stern section was sitting so low that waves were washing over the aft deck. The gap between them was 3 feet wide. Fires were burning in 4 locations. The ship looked like wreckage that had already sunk and was somehow still floating. One bomber put a bomb directly into the number 2 cargo tank. The explosion was massive. Fuel ignited. A fireball erupted from the center of the ship. The blast wave knocked men off the decks of both destroyers. When the smoke cleared, the tanker was still there. The number 2 tank had ruptured and burned, but the fire had not spread to adjacent tanks. The ship had lost another 2,000 tons of cargo. She was now carrying 6,000 tons in the remaining intact tanks. By 5 in the afternoon, Ohio was 10 miles from Malta. Commander Swain calculated that at current speed, 1 knot, they would arrive in 10 hours. That meant 3 in the morning, in darkness, in a ship that was more wreckage than vessel. Swain understood the situation completely now. They had passed the point where abandoning the tow was an option. Penn had burned too much fuel maintaining maximum power for 16 hours. She no longer had enough reserves to reach Gibraltar. Ledbury was damaged and low on ammunition. Both destroyers were committed. If they abandoned Ohio now, they would arrive in Malta, having saved nothing and wasted 2 warships in the attempt. The decision to continue the tow had not been made at 2 in the afternoon when the Admiralty sent their message. It had been made at 1 in the morning when they rigged the first tow line. Every hour since then had simply made retreat more expensive until it became impossible. They were going to deliver Ohio to Malta, or they were going to sink trying, not because it was the right choice, but because it was the only choice left. At 8 in the evening, the tow line parted again. Penn rigged another. At midnight, 8 miles from Malta, Penn's engines failed. The destroyer had been running at maximum power for 18 hours. Her boilers could not sustain the effort. She lost propulsion. HMS Ledbury took over the tow. The smaller destroyer attached her line to Ohio and began pulling. At half a knot, 8 miles to Malta meant 16 hours. It was now August 13th. Ohio had been under attack for 36 hours. She had been hit by 7 bombs and 1 torpedo. Her hull was fractured, her superstructure destroyed, her cargo tanks ruptured in 2 places. She was on fire, flooding, and held together only by the remaining fuel containers. Commander Swain stood on Ledbury's bridge, watching the wreckage they were pulling. Malta was 8 miles away. They had 16 hours to cover that distance. German aircraft would return at dawn. Penn was dead in the water. Ledbury was operating on her last reserves. And somewhere behind them, in the darkness, Ohio was still afloat, still burning, still moving toward Malta because stopping was no longer possible. August 13th, 1942, 6 in the morning, Mediterranean Sea, 8 miles from Malta. HMS Ledbury was pulling SS Ohio at half a knot. The tow line was at maximum tension. The destroyer's engines were overheating. Commander Swain had been on the bridge for 42 hours without sleep. His ship was burning fuel at a rate that left no margin for error. If they did not reach Malta within 12 hours, Ledbury would run dry, and both ships would drift helplessly until they sank or were sunk. Ohio was no longer recognizable as the vessel that had departed Gibraltar 4 days earlier. The bow and stern were separated by 4 feet of open water. The only thing connecting them was the cargo tanks, which had bent into a shallow V shape. The deck had buckled upward in the middle, creating a ridge 3 feet high. Fires were burning in 5 locations. The superstructure had collapsed. The masts were gone. Bodies were still trapped in flooded compartments that no one could reach. At 7:30, German aircraft appeared. 8 Stukas. They circled the 2 ships, assessing whether the wreckage was worth another attack. Commander Swain watched them through binoculars and waited. Ledbury had ammunition for approximately 2 minutes of sustained anti-aircraft fire. After that, the guns would be empty. The Stukas did not attack. They circled once more, then turned north toward Sicily. Possibly they assumed Ohio was already finished. Possibly they were low on fuel. The reason did not matter. They left. By 9 in the morning, Malta was visible on the horizon. Ledbury continued pulling. Ohio followed, grinding through the water in two pieces, held together by tanks that were never designed to bear structural loads. At 10:15, 3 British minesweepers came out from Grand Harbor to assist. They attached additional tow lines to Ohio's stern and bow, distributing the load across multiple ships. With 4 vessels pulling, speed increased to 1 knot. By noon, they were 3 miles from the harbor entrance. At 1 in the afternoon, Ohio stopped moving. The remaining cargo tanks had shifted. The stern section was now sitting 12 feet lower than the bow. Water was pouring into every compartment that was not already flooded. The ship was sinking, slowly but measurably. The harbor entrance was 2 miles away. Captain Mason, still on Ohio's deck, sent a signal to the minesweepers. Increase tow speed. Ship sinking. The minesweepers increased to maximum power. The tow lines went taut. Ohio moved forward at 1.5 knots, dragging through the water like a waterlogged corpse. The stern section was almost completely submerged now. Waves were washing over the aft deck. Only the buoyancy of the cargo tanks was keeping the ship from going under entirely. At 2:30 in the afternoon on August 15, 1942, SS Ohio entered Grand Harbor, Valletta, Malta. The bow section was listing 20 degrees to starboard. The stern was underwater except for the highest points of the deck. The gap between the two sections was 6 feet wide. People lining the harbor walls could see straight through the ship from one side to the other. The minesweepers positioned Ohio alongside the fueling pier. The moment the ship stopped moving, she began to settle. The stern section sank another 3 feet in the first 10 minutes. Dock workers rushed to attach fuel hoses before the tank access points went underwater. At 3 in the afternoon, pumps began transferring kerosene from Ohio's cargo tanks to shore storage. The pumping rate was 800 gallons per minute when all pumps were operating. Ohio was carrying approximately 6,000 tons of fuel in the tanks that remained intact. That equaled roughly 1.8 million gallons. At 800 gallons per minute, complete offloading would require 37 hours of continuous pumping. Ohio did not have 37 hours. She was sinking at a rate of 6 inches per hour. The tank access points would be underwater in 8 hours. After that, the fuel could not be pumped out. It would go down with the ship. The harbor master ordered all available pumps brought to the pier. By 4 in the afternoon, 6 pumps were operating simultaneously. Transfer rate increased to 3,000 gallons per minute. At that rate, they could empty the tanks in 10 hours if the pumps did not fail and the ship did not sink first. The ship continued settling. By 6 in the afternoon, the stern section was completely submerged. Only the bow section remained partially above water, held up by the buoyancy of the forward cargo tanks. The pumps kept running. At 8 in the evening, 1 pump failed. A fuel line ruptured under pressure. Dock workers replaced it and resumed pumping. At midnight, another pump failed. They replaced it. At 2 in the morning on August 16th, a 3rd pump failed. They replaced it and continued. By dawn on August 16th, Ohio had transferred approximately 1.2 million gallons to shore storage. Roughly 600,000 gallons remained in the tanks. The bow section was now sitting at a 30-degree angle. Water was entering the forward holds faster than it could be pumped out. The harbor master estimated they had 4 more hours before the remaining tank access points went underwater. At 9 in the morning, the last pump stopped. The fuel lines had been submerged. Ohio had delivered approximately 1.2 million gallons of kerosene and diesel to Malta. Roughly 600,000 gallons, approximately 2,000 tons, went down with the ship. At 10:30 on August 16, 1942, SS Ohio sank at her moorings in Grand Harbor. The bow section rolled to starboard and disappeared beneath the surface. The stern section, already under water, settled onto the harbor floor. Parts of the superstructure remained visible above the waterline. The rest was gone. Malta's fuel reserves, which had been at 3 days' supply when Ohio entered harbor, were now at 47 days' supply. The RAF squadrons continued operations. The Royal Navy destroyers continued patrols. The submarines continued hunting Axis convoys. The island remained operational. The cost of delivering 1.2 million gallons of fuel was 14 merchant ships, 1 aircraft carrier, 2 cruisers, 1 destroyer, and approximately 500 men killed. Of the 14 merchant ships that departed Gibraltar on August 9th, only 5 reached Malta. Ohio was one of them, though whether a ship that sank immediately upon arrival can be counted as having reached its destination is a question that was never formally addressed in the after-action reports. Captain Dudley Mason received the George Cross for his command of SS Ohio during Operation Pedestal. Commander Swain of HMS Penn received the Distinguished Service Order. The crew members who survived received various decorations and were reassigned to other vessels. The men who died were buried at sea or in military cemeteries in Malta and North Africa. The Admiralty classified the full casualty figures and damage assessments from Operation Pedestal for 25 years. When the documents were declassified in 1967, they revealed that senior naval officers had calculated before the convoy departed that losses would likely exceed 50% of the merchant ships and 30% of the escorts. They proceeded with the operation because the alternative was losing Malta, which would have shifted the strategic balance in the Mediterranean decisively toward the Axis. The decision was mathematically sound. Malta remained in British hands. The Africa Corps continued to face supply shortages. Rommel's advance toward Cairo stalled. The North African campaign turned in favor of the Allies. The Mediterranean remained contested rather than controlled by Germany and Italy. Whether the 500 men who died to deliver 47 days of fuel to Malta would have considered this an acceptable exchange is not recorded. They were not consulted before the operation began, and most of them did not survive to offer an opinion afterward. SS Ohio remained on the harbor floor for 14 months. In October 1943, salvage crews raised sections of the wreckage and cut them apart for scrap metal. The cargo tanks that had held the ship together during 3 days of towing were melted down and recycled. No portion of the vessel was preserved. By November 1943, SS Ohio had been completely removed from Grand Harbor and no longer existed in any physical form. The George Cross awarded to Captain Mason is on display at the Maritime Museum in Liverpool. The ship's bell, recovered during salvage operations, is held by the National War Museum in Valletta. These are the only artifacts that remain. Malta used the fuel delivered by Ohio and the 4 other surviving merchant ships from Operation Pedestal to continue operations through September and October 1942. By November, another convoy had arrived with additional supplies. By December, the siege was effectively over. By January 1943, the Axis position in North Africa was collapsing and Malta was no longer under serious threat. The fuel delivered by Operation Pedestal sustained Malta for 47 days. The siege of Malta lasted from June 1940 to November 1942, a total of 29 months. Operation Pedestal covered 47 days of that 29-month period, approximately 5% of the total duration. No one questioned whether those 47 days were the ones that mattered. The operation was declared a success. The casualties were declared acceptable. The mathematics were declared sound. In 1946, the British government awarded the George Cross to the entire island of Malta in recognition of the courage and endurance displayed by its population during the siege. It remains the only time in history that an entire civilian population has received a collective military decoration. SS Ohio is not mentioned in the citation.